Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. And so today is going to be part of the International Space University Southern Hemisphere Space Studies Program lecture series. This is actually part of the core program that we do. The Southern Hemisphere Space Studies Program is a 5-week intensive program. It's a very interdisciplinary. We talk about all aspects of space exploration. And as part of the program, actually, we'd like to share with the community and the locals some aspect of and knowledge about space. So we're very glad to have actually attendees from outside the program, to especially the young generations, to be able to learn more about space. And hopefully, they will be the future scientists, engineers, explorers of the future. So today is going to be actually about okay, there you go. So today, actually, we're going to talk about space medicine, and we have actually one of the leading space medicine experts in Australia. When you talk about space medicine, and it's actually one of the cornerstones of human space exploration. In addition to technology, there's obviously vast issues and problems when exploring the space in terms of technological challenges. But also the human aspects is as challenging as well. We know, for example, now from years of research on International Space Station, that the effects of human body, microgravity in terms of bones, muscles, visions, immunity, circulation, it's a big range. And also when we go further into different planets, the effects of cosmic radiation and psychology as well, it's very essential to talk about. So today I think it will be a very interesting talk. You guys, all of us will enjoy today. But before we start, I would like to acknowledge the Kaurna people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respect to the elders, past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal people right in this room today. So with this, I would like to welcome Dr. Gordon Piebel to the stadium here. Thank you very much.
Right, thanks, Omar. I'm very pleased you all braved the weather to come out and see me tonight. If you ever wanted to be an explorer on the surface of Venus, just step outside your front door tomorrow. It's going to be a similar temperature. Look, I've been going to a lot of meetings over the last couple of years relating to the space industry, space in general, and I've been listening to a lot of talks by physicists and rocket scientists and astronomers and people who build satellites, and it's all fantastic. It's a very exciting time in our history here in Australia when it comes to space. But you know, I always felt like the only doctor in the room at a lot of these meetings, and I'm always heartened though when people start turning their minds towards human spaceflight, because that's where medicine comes in, that's where human factors comes in. And honestly, as good as all that other science is in space, I think there's nothing more inspiring for the population generally than the thought of human space exploration. Not robotics, human space exploration. But with that comes the attendant risks of the space environment that we have to overcome. So that's really what I'm going to be talking about tonight. And I wanted to just give you background on why I'm here. I appreciate Omar saying I'm a leading expert in space medicine here in Australia, certainly not in the world, but it's a new specialty here. So it's hard to become a leading expert in anything when it's so new. However, I started getting interested in the specialty of aerospace medicine pretty much right from the time I was about 4 years old, watching Neil Armstrong's first steps on the moon as a 4-year-old, and my interest in aviation really continued. I remember as a kid building models of aeroplanes and getting into space and Star Wars like every other kid, of course. But that passion, I think, was really critical in the development of a future career. So I had that passion, but decided that medicine was what I really wanted to study. So I graduated medicine from the University of Sydney in 1988. And would you believe about the first paycheck I ever got as a doctor I spent on flying lessons? So I was down at Bankstown Airport learning to fly. And that was fantastic fun and hugely beneficial to a career which I actually didn't know existed at that time. So I was very grateful to find a journal called, at the time, Aviation, Space and Environmental Medicine. And looking through that journal and seeing the diversity of specialties involved in aerospace medicine, to look at the multidisciplinary nature of it, to look at the international nature of it, I thought, wow, this is really good. You can actually do a specialty in this. So off I went and got some postgraduate training through the University of Otago, and pretty much straight away in 1996 I started working for the Royal Australian Air Force in aerospace medicine here in Adelaide, and I've been here ever since pretty much doing the same thing. So I'm currently Head of Aerospace Medicine Training at the RAAF Institute of Aviation Medicine, and I also, as you can see there, I belong to a number of different professional organisations, but importantly from a space point of view, I chair the Space Life Sciences Committee of our local Australian professional body, which is the Australasian Society of Aerospace Medicine, and that's how I've become involved in what I'm doing here tonight. Why are we talking about this? We're talking about it, and I'm sure for those guys doing the course, you've been hearing all about the future plans. Over the next 10 to 20 years, we will be travelling deeper into space than we have since the 1970s. We haven't broken orbit since the Apollo program. We've been in low Earth orbit, and of course now we have plans to establish a presence in cislunar space with the Gateway. We're anticipating human missions to Mars beyond that, perhaps in the 2030s. Using the moon as a proving ground for technologies and even, of course, low Earth orbit in an ongoing way with the space station, trying to sort out the problems we need to solve to make those missions successful. And a lot of those problems are going to be the human element problems. What happens to physiology? There's so much stuff we still don't really know. So we have the Orion now. The sad thing is the International Space Station is the biggest spacecraft we're going to have for the foreseeable future in low Earth orbit. We are not going to be able to throw that kind of mass to Mars, which means the spacecraft are going to be quite small, and with that comes a whole bunch of physiological and human factors challenges as we go deeper into space. Even on the Gateway, that's not going to be as big as the International Space Station, and whilst not occupied continually, there are going to be some fairly long duration stays on that spacecraft with potentially surface excursions to the moon, potentially habitation on the lunar surface, and then beyond that, of course, a presence on Mars. So the future plans mean that we need to get really good at solving the problems that affect humans exposed to a very challenging environment. We've done it before. If you look back centuries in history, what we're doing now is no different really to what the seafarers and the explorers of history really did. If you think about the durations of the missions, setting sail with an armada of ships or setting sail with 200 people on board and coming back with 50, I mean, the risks that these people took quite willingly, not understanding the risks really, not understanding all the problems that they would face, not understanding the medical concerns of being at sea. The whole reason we managed to work out what scurvy was all about, vitamin C deficiency, was because of a very clever doctor who worked out citrus solved the problem of scurvy on these early ships. So the medical problems of exploration have been with us since we were explorers, which has been forever. Launching into space, we're doing the same thing. We're just doing it bigger and further and with much more expensive technology. Does everyone know that ship? That's the HMS Endeavour. Okay, so there's a bit of Australian history there. But history does repeat. If you have a look at the duration of a Mars mission architecture, it's not that different to some of the historical journeys of, for instance, Lewis and Clark exploring continental US. You can see that's very similar in duration to a Mars mission. 6 or 7 months outbound, 6 or 7 months inbound, plus probably a year and a half or two on the surface. Vasco da Gama is a Portuguese explorer who discovered India, who explored and sailed to India from Portugal. Of course, Columbus, and indeed Cook's circumnavigation of the planet, probably the most amazing exploration mission of all time. And the duration that took, of course, was extraordinary at the time. So we are going to do this again. They didn't understand all the problems, and nor do we, but the question is, do we need to understand all the problems to go? If we have to understand all the problems first, we'll never go. A lot about exploration is learning as you go by knowing enough, but not knowing at all. So what I want to do tonight is to use the paradigm of NASA's Human Research Program. This is essentially a way of summarising the important issues when it comes to space travel for humans. So I'm using this as a bit of a model to highlight some of the important issues for you guys. And I'm sure some of this will be quite familiar if you've done the Medical and Human Factors lectures last week with Dr. Gooden. I think probably the most recognisable of the challenges that we're going to face is that we are in space exposed to a microgravity environment. We have evolved to live and to function physiologically in a 1G gravity field. As soon as we go beyond the Earth, we are no longer exposed to 1G, which brings with it a whole raft of different problems. In fact, this is probably the biggest group of stuff that I was going to talk about tonight. The problem with the gravity issue is not the gravity per se. Going to space is easy. Going to microgravity is easy. Bodies are incredibly adaptable and will adapt over time. In fact, remarkably quickly. Within 3 days, you've got your space legs, the space motion sickness starts to settle. 6 weeks later, you're starting to be able to move around fairly freely, navigate about the ISS, and probably another 6 weeks after that, you're into what's called deep adaptation, so it becomes almost second nature. The good thing about going to space is that when you're de-adapted and you're not used to microgravity, if your gyros are toppled, if you're all upset in your balance, it doesn't matter because you can't fall. It hurts when you come back to Earth. Okay, 1G, that's when it matters. So it's the gravity transitions that are the problem. It's going from 1G to microgravity. It's going from microgravity to 1/6 gravity on the lunar surface. Or it's going from the microgravity environment of Mars transit to the surface at 0.38 of a G. And then having to go to, again, microgravity for 6 or 7 months before coming back to 1G. The adaptation will occur in each of those environments. It's the transitions that are the problem. Transitions of the cardiovascular system, of the balance system, and of course the problems that occur with muscle and bone we're going to talk about as well. A lot of these problems we've actually got good countermeasures for already, and they aren't so big a problem anymore. One of the biggest issues we thought originally was going to be the fluid shift that occurs in microgravity. As soon as you leave 1G, there's nothing holding all that fluid in your body down in your legs, and it moves up towards your head, which means there's a fullness in your head, which means that your kidneys start putting out more fluid to try and offload some of that volume to reduce your blood pressure. With adaptation, the reflexes that people normally have that maintain blood pressure in a 1G environment, they become deconditioned. It's the old problem, if you don't use it, you lose it. And the body doesn't need to maintain its postural blood pressure integrity in space like it does on Earth. The fact that you can get up out of the chair right now and walk to the door without passing out is thanks to these reflexes that will keep your blood pressure up as soon as you stand. But you lose that in microgravity. Of course, you lose heart muscle, or the heart muscle becomes thinner and loses its ability to pump as effectively. And the other big problem is that all that fluid heading towards the top of your body means that the pressure inside your skull increases. So there's an increase in what we call intracranial pressure. The current countermeasures we use for this, particularly before returning to a 1G environment to try and prevent these problems in that gravity transition, is things like fluid loading. So getting astronauts to drink lots of fluid and to take salt to try and increase their volume. There are garments that can be worn to push the fluid from the lower body back up to the upper part of the body when you come back to 1G, similar to a G-suit might wear, that a G-suit might wear as a pilot, for example. Making a bit of a comeback is a thing called lower body negative pressure, used back in the 70s and in the Skylab days. It's actually a big suction device that sucks fluid down into the lower body in microgravity to try and maintain that gravity, that fluid gradient. There's positioning that we can do. So, for example, being supine on re-entry, and particularly on launch, but on re-entry, so that the gravity isn't pushing from head to toe, it's pushing chest to back, and that makes a big difference. But one of the big countermeasures that seems to work for many things, including the cardiovascular system, interestingly, is exercise. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But the astronauts on station currently at the moment do about 2.5 hours worth of exercise every day, except Sunday. That's their day off. But every other day they have to build that into their very busy work schedule, because if they don't, it's a problem. There was a Dr. Stan Love who went to space on the shuttle. It wasn't a long mission. He decided, because he was so busy, the last thing he needed to add into his program was the exercise that had been prescribed, so he didn't do it. After 2 weeks of space, he came back. It took him 2 months to recover and rehabilitate from that flight. So it makes a difference, and the astronauts know that. One of the biggest problems, and actually is one of the most important priorities NASA has identified, and we think it's related to microgravity, is a thing that affects vision. It's called SANS. There's an acronym for everything in medicine and in aviation, of course, and in space. SANS means Spaceflight Associated Neuroocular Syndrome. This was first noticed on a shuttle mission probably about a decade ago. A colleague of mine, Dr. Bob Thirsk, and another physician, Dr. Michael Barrett, were both on orbit at the same time, noticed visual changes, and they thought, right, we're physicians, we can work this out. So they got out their ophthalmoscopes, which is the torch you look in the back of the eye with. They had a look in each other's eyes, and they thought, oh, there are some changes there in the retina, which we haven't seen before. And there opened this Pandora's box of research to try and work out what was going on with the eyes. We can see on imaging that the eye gets flatter in microgravity, and that probably explains this loss of near vision that the astronauts complain of, and in fact they take with them to orbit anticipatory glasses, they call them. So they take glasses with them anticipating the fact that their vision is going to be changed. But with further investigation, we found that it's not just the flattening. There are changes in the retina itself. There are changes in the nerve from the back of the eye. It's changing its shape. It's kinking. There is swelling of the nerve as it comes into the eyeball. And the reason for this is really poorly understood at this stage. So there's lots more research to be done, but it's considered to be one of the showstoppers. What's the point of going to Mars if you can't see when you get there? So we need to solve this problem. Balance and posture is probably the problem that we have the least countermeasures for. When you go to space and you aren't in a 1G environment anymore, your balance system switches off. The gravity sensors, called the otolith organs in the inner ear, don't respond to anything anymore. To gravity anymore. All they respond to is linear movement, backwards and forwards, up and down. And it creates a big disconnect between what the balance system's telling the brain and what the eyes are telling the brain. And that leads to space motion sickness, which is usually worst in the first 72 hours, and then it generally settles down after that. About a third of people have really bad sickness, a third say it's moderate, doesn't impair them too badly, and a third say, well, don't admit to getting it at all. So you don't really know if that's true. But this is the balance system saying, hey, we don't have gravity anymore. What are we trying to tell the brain? And it's very confusing. There's been about 20% of shuttle landings that have missed the mark in terms of accuracy. The shuttle had auto-land systems on it. The pilot usually chose to land manually, but if you look at the landing pattern of the shuttle, about 20% of flights were outside of what would be considered ideal parameters, and it was largely due to the fact that the pilot's balance system, coming back to 1G, is not ideally suited to landing a space vehicle. It affects balance, it affects your vision, and if I play this video, this isn't a video of Drew Feustel, who came back to Earth from the ISS after spending 200 days there. I just want you to watch him walking. This is on YouTube, it's a public video. This is essentially immediately upon landing. He was being tested in his gait. This is an absolutely normal vestibular system struggling to readapt to 1G, having been in microgravity for 200 days. Now, what happens when we go to Mars? What happens when you've been in microgravity for 6 months and you have to get out of the space vehicle? What happens if you have to manually land the vehicle in an emergency and your balance system is off? These are the problems that are currently being looked at. We don't know the answers to a lot of this stuff. We think exercise helps, we think training helps in terms of desensitizing the vestibular system, but there's lots more work to do. We all know that if you don't use it, you lose it. Muscles waste in microgravity. You can lose up to 20% of your muscle fibre thickness. They atrophy is the word in medicine. And they can sometimes actually change the type of fibre, how they twitch, how they respond when they move, which means that your strength is less. You get tired more easily. And to be honest with you, all of 12 people have walked in 1/6 gravity. We know we can walk on the moon, but what happens when we're there for a long time? How much exercise do we have to do in 1/6 gravity to keep bones and muscles strong? We know what to do in microgravity. We've been doing that on the ISS for a long time. But we have absolutely no idea of how much lunar regolith we have to lift every day to keep our muscles strong, and what the exercise prescription is going to be. We do know that pre-flight conditioning is really important though. Bulking up before you go does help offset some of these muscle changes. Bones lose strength. Bones lose mineral density, very similar to the medical condition called osteoporosis that we see on Earth. So research into this in astronauts is going to help us treat clinically populations of people on Earth and potentially prevent a lot of disability and morbidity. You can lose, if you don't exercise, you can lose about 1.5% of your bone density per month, and it's the load-bearing bones, as it is with load-bearing muscles. The anti-gravity muscles waste, and it's the load-bearing bones in the lower body predominantly and lower back that lose density. And the problem with that, of course, it can lead to a risk of fractures. When we start ambulating on planetary surfaces, we're not just floating around on orbit doing an EVA. There is the potential for trauma. There's trips and falls and other sources of trauma that might affect astronauts. And all that mineral that's washing out of your bones has to go somewhere. Guess where it goes? To your kidneys. And there is a high risk of forming renal stones, and we need ways to mitigate and treat that months and months from Earth. So that needs to be really well trained into how you deal with that. So microgravity, very complex issue, lots of considerations from a medical point of view, some of which we have good countermeasures for, like exercise and fluids. Balance, for example, we have at this point not a lot to go on. So there's a lot of research going on in that field. The second hazard that the Human Research Program identifies is isolation and confinement. And this is largely a psychological and a behavioural health issue. What happens to the human mind and body when you lock it away in a tight environment for months at a time with limited external cues or contacts or stimulus from a world that normally gives the brain a lot of feedback on how you're going, in a tight environment with other crew members, which of course introduces the problem of team cohesion, team bonding, interpersonal relationships. There is the problem of sleeping in tight environments. The quality and quantity of sleep for most astronauts is much poorer than what they get on Earth. How is that going to affect missions of longer duration? Just somebody getting up to go to the bathroom on the Orion is going to wake up everybody else on the spacecraft. So it's going to be a problem that we have to think about in terms of performance. How is that going to affect cognitive performance? The other thing is, how do you keep really highly trained, highly motivated, high-functioning individuals, which these astronauts necessarily are going to be, how do you keep them from getting bored on a 6 to 7 month mission? Bearing in mind, this is a different paradigm now. We're going from an ISS platform, which is an experimental platform. It is designed to be a research laboratory. There's research and science going on all day, every day, except Sunday. This is a different paradigm. This is an exploration paradigm. It's not a science platform. So how do you keep the astronauts from getting bored? How do you keep them trained? How do you keep their minds active? There's a lot of planning that's going to have to go into that to make sure that they have, for example, just-in-time training to deal with the landing on Mars or medical issues that might arise. So strategies need to be developed to maintain their performance, their morale, the team cohesion and bonding for 6 or 7 months at a time. Selection is going to be critical for that. In terms of mitigating it, other things that we can do, training, as I said earlier on, making sure the expectations are there, they know what they're getting themselves in for. Once they break orbit, trans-Mars injection, they're going to Mars. There's no turning around, oh, I don't want to go anymore and turn around. That doesn't happen. So they have to be built, that expectation has to be built in with training. We need to monitor their performance. Monitoring diaries, they diarise constantly, but also monitoring other behavioural parameters to monitor for things like depression that might be creeping in or other mood disturbances. Scheduling work appropriately. Should they schedule their own work, or should they have really tightly scheduled routines as they do now? Most of the astronauts who come back from ISS, I think, and if Paolo is here, I'm not sure he is, but I think a lot of them do say they would like more autonomy in what they do. And that work scheduling autonomy might give them a feeling of self-determination. And also addressing sleep on the station, on the spacecraft. How do you get good quality and quantity of sleep? When you go to beyond Earth orbit, there's no night and day. It's just sunlight constantly. Even on orbit, on the station, you've got 16 sunrises and sunsets every day. From a circadian rhythm point of view, that is really disruptive. And trying to promote sleep is looking at sleep hygiene, but also, for example, the appropriate correct medications that might be used that don't impair performance in an emergency. The spacecraft is necessarily a closed environment, and a lot of space environments are also hostile. Why is it closed? Because the space environment is going to kill you if you are exposed to it. We need to take everything with us. A spacecraft needs to have life support. It needs to give us air, it needs to give us water, it needs to deal with waste, human and otherwise, and it needs to be able to provide us with food. Now, at the moment, pretty much everything is resupplied to a closed, with not an exactly closed system, the ISS, but it's getting there. But the idea is we are going to have to recycle everything to make this work. We're pretty good at it now, but we've got to get even better. We have to be able to recycle pretty much all the water that we need. We need to recycle all the air that we need until such time as we get to a planet, Mars for example, where we can use in situ resource utilisation to, for example, use the surface water of Mars to generate some of this stuff. But it does raise the issue of, how do you keep food fresh? How do you store it? Can you produce food yourself? Maintaining comfortable temperature in the spacecraft, in the hostile temperatures of space. Maintaining an adequate pressure in the spacecraft so that there is no risk of decompression illness. Managing light levels and managing wavelengths of light to offset the problem that you and I will know about with your iPhones. If you look at your iPhones late in the day and it's giving off that blue light, it's telling the brain it's time to wake up. Okay, so managing the wavelengths of light using LED lighting is an important strategy in trying to manage the sleep cycles in this very, very closed environment. These spacecraft are noisy machines. The life support systems themselves generate a lot of noise. So keeping ambient noise levels at acceptable levels is going to be important from a hearing protection point of view, but also a comfort point of view and a sleep point of view. And as I mentioned earlier, the amount of mass we can throw to Mars is going to be relatively small. The habitable space is going to be much smaller than what we have now. But what is the minimum required habitable space that a human being can tolerate? There's research going on about that at the moment. There's no maximum specified, by the way. The bigger the better, but small, tight spaces. We know humans can adapt to that. We know that the seafarers of years past confined to small spaces on ships and so on. We can do it. But the question is, we've never done it like this in space with all the other additive challenges. In a closed environment, there are other hostile things to consider and threats. Just simply the use of, for example, tools on a planetary surface. If you're a geologist and you're off doing geology on the surface of Mars, and you're using tools and you're lifting things and you're moving things, you're constructing things, there is a potential for injury, for trauma just in that. For puncturing a spacesuit, if it happens to be a pressurised spacesuit, there is a threat. You lose your breathable atmosphere. But there are other threats as well. There's no resupply possible. It's this closed environment. And within that closed environment, unfortunately, bacteria and other bugs like to have a bit of a party. They really have a field day. The environment starts off being sterile. The bugs come from us. We all have our own microbiome. We have bugs living on us and we need them and we take them to space with us. The problem is what happens if they become pathogenic? What happens if they change their pathogenicity because of, for example, radiation? We know there are changes in bacterial cell walls as a result of spaceflight. We know they become slightly more pathogenic because of that. They become more resistant to treatments. Along with that, to make matters worse, the human immune system is suppressed by space for a number of different reasons. Stress and stress levels, hormones related to stress, for example, are a factor involved there, cortisol. But immunity is probably changing for other reasons as well that we don't really understand. But the number of the set of immune cells in your body that fight infection, called T cells, decrease. Your antibody-related immunity decreases as well, and we can measure an increase in viral reactivation. For example, the herpes virus becomes more active. It doesn't necessarily cause disease, but we can measure that the viral load increases in astronauts because of this immune suppression. So here we have a potential for bacteria to be a problem because they're more pathogenic, and the human immune system is being suppressed because we are going deeper into space and we're subjected to these environments. And then there's the other environmental threat of contaminants aboard the spacecraft. The worst possible scenario for any spacefarer would be fire and smoke on the spacecraft. But there are other contaminants, volatile substances that evolve from the surfaces of things within the spacecraft, which can cause a problem for human health. On the lunar surface, lunar regolith is becoming a fairly hot topic for discussion. What happens if you breathe in lunar dust? We need to mitigate that. Now, closed environments, we can monitor them. We can do swabbing. We can look for bacteria. We can monitor the environment. We can measure levels of carbon dioxide in the environment. We can measure radiation. We can do all that stuff and try and keep things within a safe limit. We can try and make, as much as possible, the environment a closed loop so that the food you grow is the vegetation that produces the oxygen that you breathe. and that the water cycle is all self-contained within that environment to manufacture the atmosphere, manufacture the water, and give you the food as well. So there's lots of work going on in that regard. The lighting I talked about in terms of fatigue management, but the closed-loop life support would mitigate the problems of no resupply. But we've tried this before on Earth, and it didn't work. Some of you may recognise biosphere. Many years ago, this was tried in the US. They locked a bunch of people, I think 8 people away, and the plan was to lock them away for at least a year, probably 2, in this closed habitat which had its own ecosystems within it of savanna and ocean and desert and water ecosystems and animals and insects, and they tried to make it entirely self-contained, living off the land, as it were, in this environment. All the oxygen that you would generate would be generated from within that system. But the oxygen levels plummeted. The carbon dioxide levels built up. All the bees died immediately, so there was no pollination of the plants that they needed. Contaminants started to cause a problem in the breathable atmosphere. And just to make matters worse, the occupants of the biosphere, after several months, just wanted to kill each other. They divided into 2 camps, and there was this huge dispute, so from a human factors point of view, it didn't work out either. Psychologically, that was a disaster. So can we do it in space, is the question. Can we do it on the way to Mars, or can we do it on Mars? Distance is the 4th issue. We are going further than we ever have before, as I said. If you have a look at the distance to the ISS, it's only 400 kilometres. It's less than here to Melbourne. Right. So distance, it's not a distance barrier we have with the ISS, it's a speed barrier. They're going at 28,000 kilometres an hour around the planet. That's the problem. The distance is, they can be back on Earth in hours to a couple of days if they have to in an emergency. But the further you go, that isn't going to be possible. The moon is 384,000 kilometres away, 3 days' journey at least. Mars can be at furthest to approach 400 million kilometres away. So that really is a problem for resupply, for communication, and for evacuation if there is a problem. Those 3 things are going to be nothing like we've seen before in low Earth orbit. We don't have this help from home. How much communication is necessary communication or is needed communication for the astronauts? At furthest approach, 22 minutes is the one-way communication time. So it's 44 minutes round trip. That's not doable. If you're trying to deal with an emergency, you need autonomy, you need to have self-determination to deal with issues. And if issues arise, all you do is report back to mission control, such and such happened, we've done this, we've mitigated it, we are now in ops normal recovery, all fine, how was your day? It's that kind of thing that we're going to have to move towards. There is limited bandwidth. There's going to be nothing like the internet we use. I mean, the amount of data backwards and forwards is going to be limited. The failures are going to have to be dealt with by the crew, and then there's the whole medical emergency problem. How do we deal with that? Anything that is considered planetary exploration, NASA has said a physician needs to be on the crew. But planetary doesn't include moon. Okay, so the physicians don't need to go to the moon, nor do they need to be in low Earth orbit. We've coped so far. But how do we deal with medical emergencies, and what do you take? What do you plan for? I'll talk more about that in a second, but let's talk about food for a start. You have to have pre-planned the food that you take. You need enough food supply to last you for an entire mission, potentially, unless you have this bioregenerative system. When you talk about medical problems, though, what skill set does the crew need to have? If you have a physician on board and the physician becomes incapacitated, who does the medical treatment then? So they need to be multi-skilled, and all the crew need to be trained to some extent in medical techniques and procedures. What equipment do you take? You can't take everything. So what you need to do is look at the things that could possibly happen, the most likely things that will happen, based on our current knowledge, based on spaceflight to date. What are the medical conditions that we've seen on the ISS, for example? They're the things that we're likely to see again, knowing that we screen people really tightly, that they're really healthy to start with, but it doesn't mean to say that things can't crop up. I'm sure you're all aware of the Fred Hayes story on Apollo 13. Fred Hayes, on the way back, apart from having to deal with an exploded spacecraft and barely breathable atmosphere, he developed a urinary tract infection. and that was for many reasons, but he became incredibly unwell, and one of the big problems with spaceflight, one of the risks that we need to mitigate against is sepsis, is infection. The problem was the two different antibiotics were carried on Apollo 13. The bug was not sensitive to either of those antibiotics. You can't take everything with you, so what do you take? What do you take? Autonomous systems might help, so having artificial intelligence, for example, to assist in diagnosis could be one strategy, but self-sufficiency is going to be the key. One of the other problems we have is if we do send medication to space, we know that radiation probably affects the half-life, the shelf life of the drugs. So what do you send? How long is it going to last? If you send a drug to space, is it going to last 3 years until you come back? We don't have the answers to that yet necessarily. Finally, I think probably one of the other most common things that people are very well aware of in the space environment is radiation. As soon as you go beyond the Earth's magnetic field, radiation is very different. It's more damaging. We think of it as being different. We think of it as being damaging. What it is actually universe situation normal. The Earth is a protective bunker. The whole universe is bathed in radiation. We're just protected because we've got this wonderful planet with an atmosphere and a magnetic field that protects us from this radiation. But as soon as we go beyond that, we are exposed to what the rest of the universe calls normal. We have solar radiation coming at us all the time, largely protons, some alpha particles. The problem with solar radiation is the solar particle event, where there can be a dramatic increase in the flux of radiation coming from the sun, to the extent it might cause acute illness in astronauts. But beyond that, there is the constant, ubiquitous background galactic cosmic radiation, GCR, X-rays and gamma rays, but there is the particle radiation, which is there as well. High energy and high mass, it's called HZE particles, high atomic mass, high energy particles, travelling close to the speed of light with atomic masses up to and including uranium. That has a very large impact when it hits a macromolecule in your body, and that has damaging effects which we need to mitigate. Low Earth orbit, not too bad. We're still within the magnetic field. As soon as we break out of that and go to the moon, we've probably got about double what the astronauts on the ISS would expect. In deep space, beyond a planet, it's probably at least 3 or 4 times what the ISS currently experiences. Mars, interestingly, is not as bad as you'd think. The planet itself gives you some shielding because of the bulk of the planet. You only get GCR coming at you from one direction instead of multiple directions. And of course, the planet, the regolith, can be used to dig into and to protect us using 2 or 3 metres of massive rock between the astronauts and space. But cancer is a real risk with all of this. There is also a concern about central nervous system degeneration and whether that might lead to subtle cognitive and performance decrements in the crews on their way to Mars in deep space. Similar to what you might see, for example, in dementia. It's that sort of syndrome. I'll come back to the reproductive risk. Cardiovascular risk, there is some evidence that the inside of blood vessels are damaged by radiation. Cataracts in the eye, an opacity of your lens, is a well-recognised complication and occupational risk of astronauts. And if a solar particle event occurs, that can be fatal with acute radiation sickness. The reproductive risk I just threw up there because if we are truly serious about colonising somewhere like Mars in the longer term, and we're not just fly in, fly out crews, if we're actually going to stay and reproduce, we need to sort that, and we haven't. There have been some animal experiments on orbit looking at self-fertilizations and how embryos develop in different animal models, but we have zero information about what happens in terms of human reproduction, embryo development, childhood development. But I think it's well recognised that if children are born in this environment, that they will adapt and they will be adapted to the environment into which they are born, and that will be an evolutionary process. So human biology and physiology will change because of that adaptation. For the rocket scientists in the room, can you please invent propulsion systems that get us places quicker? Right. That is going to solve a bunch of these problems. If we can get there quick, we aren't exposed to the same amount of radiation. We aren't exposed to microgravity for as long, all that kind of stuff. So propulsion is really important, but we need to monitor radiation levels. We do that now. There's designs for creating magnetic fields around spacecraft, creating its own little geomagnetic field. There are certain substances which we know if we put around the astronauts in a protective way, around the habitat can protect them. For example, water is a really good one. Building shelters underground. If you do a mission to Mars, chances are that's only going to be your one and only mission, because you will have exceeded your dose for your life in terms of radiation. So career exposures, and there are some research projects going on looking at drugs in treating and mitigating radiation. There are no magic bullet drugs that exist currently, but they're looking at things like antioxidants for that purpose. I'm going to finish up and allow questions in a second, but I just want to come back to this thought about history repeating. This is always a vexed slide to put up because it unfortunately changes fairly frequently, but the current oldest person in the world is a Japanese woman by the name of Kane Tanaka, who was born in 1903. The same year the Wright brothers first flew at Kitty Hawk. So in the space of a human lifetime, we have gone from the first ever powered flight to routine operations in low Earth orbit, and we have put humans on the moon in that time frame. That's really extraordinary when you think about it, in one human lifetime. In Cook's day, it took 7 months to sail from England to Australia. On a Qantas Boeing 787, you can fly from Perth to London in 17 hours. Thank you very much. Okay, that is well and truly miraculous when you think about it. In the days of early aviation, the barnstormers took people up for joyrides. When all the pilots came out of the military in the First World War, they thought, what can we do? Oh, I know, let's do a circus ride. So they take people barnstorming, and it was fun. But aviation developed from that into purposeful point-to-point transport, not only that, but faster than the speed of sound. Can I suggest to you that the current wave of commercial operations, SpaceX, Blue Origin, the suborbital flights which are barnstorming at the moment, how long is it going to take before that becomes purposeful point-to-point transport, where we actually fly from one side of the planet to the other, according to Elon Musk, in under an hour? And I would also say to you, in how many human lifetimes will it take us to go from our current exploratory ambitions to the Moon and Mars, hopefully to other planets within the solar system, perhaps becoming an interplanetary species? How long will it take us to become an interstellar species? That's the notional design of a faster-than-light vehicle, which some of you may have seen, Alcubierre Drive or something. He's a South African gentleman who's been looking at the physics of it. So will that come to fruition? I really don't know. But here is something I just wanted to leave you with. I wrote this a little while ago, and I think it's just telling, I think, that humans are explorers. We need to go. We can't just send robots. There is something essential in our DNA. There's something essential in the experiential nature of exploring and exploration, the things that we discover. And I think from certainly all the astronauts that I've spoken to, and Paolo is probably no different, you come back with a change in perception. You come back with a changed worldview. It's called the overview effect. You look at the planet and humanity a little bit different when you see where we sit in the greater scheme of the universe. And I think we learn more about ourselves by space exploration than we learn about the Moon or Mars or anywhere else for that matter. And that might be the only thing that actually wakes us up and saves us from ourselves in the longer term. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave you and take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cable. So we have time for several questions. If you can, okay, we have one there, Keith.
If there is a microphone, please use it. My hearing's dreadful.
In 2001, A Space Odyssey, we had that lovely vision of the astronaut running around the inside of the big circular space station in order to get some exercise. Has any research gone into investigating that as a method of overcoming the problems of microgravity?
Yeah, the problem, well, not a problem. The concept of artificial gravity certainly has been explored. It's largely an engineering problem of what sort of centrifuge do you build, how big, and the engineering problems attendant upon that. But more than the engineering problems, there are physiological problems, again relating to the balance system. Yes, you can build a space station. In fact, if you do the math on that very space station and work out the rate of rotation based on the film, the amount of gravity, it's about 800 metres across if you do the calculations, and it's about 1 g at the perimeter. So the math, it works, but to do that, you know, to make it work, it has to be a very large station. As soon as you start spinning people in that rotating environment, it leads to some vestibular and balance problems. Every time you turn your head, move around, it causes a tumbling of your gyros. You get dizzy and quite motion sick at times. It's potentially possible to adapt to that, but the smaller the radius and the faster the turn, the bigger the problem. So how much G do you want to generate? How big a mass can you use? They've also looked at onboard centrifuges, just centrifuge the astronaut in an onboard centrifuge for a while, but then what's the prescription for that? How often do you do it? And that's a heavy thing to take to space. You know, how do you get that on board a spacecraft? So yes, it's been thought about. One of the other problems with the centrifugation is gravity gradient. The gravity, because of the radius, the distance between head and feet, the gravity experienced at head level is different to the gravity experienced at foot level. If you move about a rotating environment, for those of you who know a little bit of meteorology, there's a Coriolis effect that causes wind to move in a circular pattern across the Earth. Coriolis force affects astronauts when they're spun. So if you're on that big space station and you try climbing up a ladder, you're going to get pushed sideways by the Coriolis force. So there's a number of things that need to be better understood and worked through. But wouldn't it be lovely to take gravity with us? It would solve all of these problems. Agreed.
Hi. With your talk, it was quite interesting, of course, but you didn't mention anything about gender preference. Is it better to have all male or all female or a mixture? And is there an advantage in either gender for space travel?
It's hard to cover everything in 45 minutes, that's true. There are probably some biological differences, particularly in sensitivity to radiation between females and males. But to be honest with you, a lot of the answer to that question is entirely unknown because the number of females flown in space is very small and we don't have statistical significance in the studies that have been done. I don't think there are any dramatic differences between males and females that we have discovered so far, other than concern over reproductive health, sensitivity to radiation. It's probably not a level playing field for that purpose. But in terms of other physiology, I don't think too much has been highlighted. But the total number of people flying in space to date is mid-500s, under 600 people. Of that, a very small proportion, relatively, are female. So the studies really are not statistically powerful enough to give us any definitive answers yet. It's going to be one of those things that I think we're going to learn by doing. But there has always been a predominance of males in the astronaut corps over females. So it's going to be a hard question to answer, but a really good one. And if we're going to colonise and we're going to reproduce, it's an essential question to answer, obviously.
Yeah, is there any shielding technology that is in use to prevent cancer and other effects of radiation in space that's in use to, in any ways that astronauts generally try to avoid harmful contact with the radiation?
Yeah, I mean, a certain amount of shielding is provided by structure. So the space station, the spacecraft, just by virtue of the fact you are inside something, protects to a certain extent, but it comes with a downside in that these highly ionised particles, when they hit structure, they generate secondary radiation, which is neutrons, which are just as bad. Okay, and they can do damage to you as well. So the main problem is going to be solar particle events. We can protect from those fairly easily because they are lower flux, lower energy particles coming at us compared to galactic cosmic radiation. So the strategy that is going to be used is simply bulking mass around the astronauts in a shelter. So it's like going in a bomb shelter, okay? If there's a solar particle event, they're going to bury themselves in the centre of the Orion spacecraft, cover themselves with lots of stuff, probably as much water as they can muster, and that's going to be the protection. That's pretty much all we've got. If you've seen some of the notional designs for Mars architecture spacecraft, you might have seen the Lockheed Martin design of Mars Base Camp, for example. The habitat on that spacecraft is surrounded by the fuel cells. Anything that contains a lot of hydrogen, and of course water contains a lot of hydrogen, but hydrogen is a good protector against radiation. So it's using stuff and putting it around is the only strategy at this point.
Doctor, thank you for an excellent talk. My question to you, it's kind of two parts. One, when you're talking about intracranial pressure, does that mean astronauts are at a higher risk of stroke and aneurysm? And the other, could you comment further about inhaling lunar regolith? Because my understanding, those particles are quite sharp and could be potentially quite dangerous.
Yeah, okay. First part of your question, stroke, no, unless there is any demonstrated vascular problems arising from radiation, but the intracranial pressure is outside the blood vessel. So we're talking about the fluid around the brain that bathes the brain, not the blood pressure per se in the vessel. So stroke and dilatation such as aneurysms, not a problem, but the pressure around the brain could potentially be a problem because we think it's causing some issues pressing on the eyes and leading to this space flight associated neuroocular syndrome. The second question was relating to... that's right, regolith. Yes, it's nasty stuff. It floats, because of the radiation, it ionises and it repels electrostatically, so it floats off the surface up to about this sort of height. It sticks to everything, and it is sharp. It's corrosive. It erodes through anything that you need to have tightly fitting as a seal, and of course that's pretty much every life support system we've ever invented. It's going to erode all that away very quickly. It coats solar panels, degrades their pools. So it does a bunch of stuff, but the concern is what happens if you inhale it. There's a big occupational medicine risk here. I think it's very similar to the problem that we had many years ago with coal miners. Coal miners' lung, inhaling silica dust, which led to a whole bunch of fibrosis in lungs and pulmonary disease. So we need to be going into this with eyes open and not only mitigating the risk in terms of making sure we try and get the regolith off everybody, the dust off, using air showers or by whatever mechanism possible, because it gets everywhere. I know you guys have seen photos of the lunar astronaut suits coated in this stuff, right? So it would get in the LEM. It's got potential to get in whatever lander we send up there in the future. But we need to do biological monitoring. So we need to be pulmonary function testing of astronauts and making sure that they're fit before they go. They're monitored while they're there. We do environmental monitoring of the atmosphere to make sure that dust particulate concentrations are lower than whatever's deemed acceptable, and then clearly screening the astronauts when they come back. So it's going to be a surveillance program and making sure that we monitor their lung function whilst they're there, because we are going to be exposed to it for much longer than we ever have before. The Apollo missions were camping trips by comparison to what we want to do, and we've had such limited experience with that, so we will learn as we go.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
With sleep habits, has anything of significance been learned from people living in polar regions where they get, say, 3 or 4 months of daylight and then 3 or 4 months of darkness?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. The closest analogue we have to spaceflight on Earth is probably the Antarctic and polar regions. There are other analogues which aren't too bad. We use submarines, we use oil rigs, but the Australian Antarctic Division, for example, has been working in conjunction with NASA for a long time, doing collaborative work. And wintering over in Antarctica is analogous to being on Mars. You may as well be on Mars. You can't get home. You are stuck there. And the light-dark cycle, clearly the circadian cycle, is completely disrupted. So there are universities that have done collaborative research with NASA, with Australian Antarctic Division and NASA, in fact, studying fatigue and circadian rhythms in Antarctic expeditioners wintering over. So, and it's not just the light-dark thing, but it's also about the confinement, about the work schedules, the stress of being confined and so on, which can disrupt sleep. There's a whole bunch of different strategies and factors that have been explored there. So, yes, the answer to that is definitely.
Has methodologies been identified by looking at the way these people live?
Well, look, the way to mitigate it is really to try and use the internal lighting. And again, wavelength of lighting is important. So using blue wavelengths in the morning or at the beginning of a workday, redder wavelengths at night to promote sleep. Education about sleep hygiene, use of medications if appropriate. There's a number of things that we can look at, trying to get comfortable quarters and dark quarters and mitigate things, use relaxation techniques and so on. The Antarctic Division is currently trialling some software called the Virtual Space Station, which is a way of using virtual reality to do mental health monitoring of people wintering over in Antarctica. So there's a lot of strategies using those sort of psychological techniques that are being looked at, and they will have huge importance when it comes to space operations. Yeah.
Hi, Gordon.
Hi.
Thanks for your presentation. It was very enjoyable. You've also scared me from going into space.
Yeah, I know.
Can you tell us about some physiological benefits of space travel? What makes us superhuman by travelling in space?
Well, you know, there was a theory that going to space might have a beneficial effect on the ageing process. So what do? They sent John Glenn back to space as an old spacefarer, and they wanted to see what the effect of space flight was on an age. Well, he wasn't really that aged, was he? I think he was 70-something. He was a very fit man still, and he went to space, and the NASA medical researchers prodded and poked him like a lab rat when they got him back. And they found absolutely no difference. He coped with it like a 40-year-old. So, look, the benefits of spaceflight. I'm hard-pressed to think of one off the top of my head for an individual. I think, though, as a population, the benefits are going to come from what we learn about physiology, not so much about what it does to our physiology. It's the translational medicine of what we learn on orbit or in space, and how that then can be used to the benefit of human populations. I used the example of osteoporosis, for example. You know, how we mitigate bone loss in astronauts will help us treat patients on Earth. How we treat vestibular problems, balance problems in astronauts. How we assess their a thing called proprioception, your ability to pick where your joints are in space, which, as you can imagine, when there's no gravity, gets totally messed up. If we can understand that process better and mitigate that, we can, again, treat people with balance disorders and Parkinson's disease and other problems here on Earth. The things that we learn about telemedicine and remote medical care and autonomous medical systems can be used to treat people stuck in remote environments, rural environments, and improve their health. So there are a number of benefits, I think, for a population as a whole rather than individuals. I'm hard-pressed to think of anything beneficial from going to space of a person, because when they come back, they're doing this kind of thing and they're weaker, their bones are demineralised.
It's like in the movie Contact where he goes up to space because
it
won't progress as fast.
As they say in the classics, no.
Well, Dr. Kerr, maybe one more question before we conclude. My question is actually about hibernation.
Yeah.
So hibernation actually has limited research recently, but has huge potential applications for space exploration and for the medical community here on Earth. And for space, for example, we can stabilize somebody, bring him to Earth in case of emergencies, and we can use it also to send people when we have missions outside of our solar system that requires years and years to actually limit the resources, the oxygen, the food, and psychological effects, even radiation effects as well. And obviously here on Earth, there will be huge advantages of having something like that. So any word on the latest research on that?
We do it already. We haven't done it in space, but there's certainly, it's early days for using it in space, but we have used therapeutic cooling, cryogenics if you like, for various forms of major surgery for a long period of time to slow down metabolism and increase survival of people who require sort of major cardiac surgery, for example. By cooling the body, it slows down their physiological responses to that trauma. So we've been doing it here for a long period of time, but how can that be applied to space? It's very early days. Right. But it would probably come down to a cooling technique of the body, slowing the body right down into a very, very deep state of, as you say, hibernation. Yeah. And perhaps we can learn from other animals that hibernate the best techniques to do that. But really, I think the technology is very much in its infancy at this point.
Thank you. And I think one more question there. And,
is it a possible hazard or anything, and if so, is there a way to stop it, of pieces of shrapnel and stuff spinning around the Earth and possibly hitting it and ripping a hole through it?
That's a good question. The space debris problem. It's only getting worse, isn't it? I just hope someday it doesn't trap us on the surface of our own planet. But it's not really a medical problem, but it is a threat. It's a risk of the space environment. From a physiological point of view, the risk of that to the astronauts is a sudden loss of their breathable atmosphere. So a sudden catastrophic decompression of a spacecraft or the space station, which means that they wouldn't have enough oxygen to breathe, they wouldn't have enough pressure in the spacecraft to keep them alive. And I'm here to tell you guys, if you ever want to be exposed to altitudes above 63,000 feet, that's all it has to be, 63,000 feet, no higher, don't do it, because your blood will boil. Okay, your blood will boil. The pressure is so low at even 63,000 feet that water vaporises inside your body and starts to boil spontaneously. Never mind about actually a hard vacuum. So I don't know how to fix the debris problem. Elon Musk's got some ideas, I hear. But I'm certainly happy to think about how we mitigate the risk to astronauts. But when you've got two things coming together at 28,000 kilometres an hour, it's going to punch a hole. I don't think there's much you can do about that.
Yeah, I've seen a picture of
What we might be able to do, I don't know what's going to stop punching a hole in somebody's leg, but if you've got a mechanical counter-pressure spacesuit instead of an inflatable spacesuit, if a piece of shrapnel goes through a counter-pressure spacesuit, you're not going to have a rapid loss of pressure and the astronaut is much more likely to survive. So there may be technologies like that that will be better off not only in EVA operations on orbit, but also on planets. If you fall over and scrape yourself and rip a hole in your suit's not going to suddenly decompress on Mars, which would be a huge advantage. So the mechanical counter-pressure versus the inflatable big balloon suits, that is something that we're looking at as well.
This is all the time we have this evening. We'd like to thank Dr. Kebil one more time, please. We'd like to thank all of you for joining us this evening. I would like to remind you that next Saturday also, we have the last distinguished lecture by Dr. Pete Worden, talking about Starship and exploration of other planets outside of our solar system. So after this, you guys are welcome to join us for a reception outside. What's that?
31st January, Thursday.
Yes.
The opportunities in space.
Okay, yeah, on Thursday as well, there's here in Mouser Lakes opportunities in space as well, so you're more than welcome to join us for this. Okay, good evening, everyone.